Okay, in this lecture, we're going to talk a little bit more about fish populations. Last time we talked about density. Now we're going to talk about things like age structure, mortality, and natality, but mostly mortality. You remember what a population is? We've talked about them. Sometimes we call populations stocks in fisheries. And we said they had four characteristics: a density, an age structure, a mortality rate, and a natality rate. And perhaps you could consider genetic structure another characteristic of populations. Last time we talked about CPUE and mark recapture as estimates of density. Now let's talk about the rest of the stuff, starting with age structure. So age structure is just what it sounds like: the relative number of young fish and old fish, and looking at the sex ratios as well. So this is one way that you could look at age structure. You could make a numbers pyramid where each part of the pyramid represents the number of organisms in a given age class. And by looking at the shape of the pyramid, you can kind of get a general idea of an estimate of what's going to happen in your population. For example, if you look at the pyramid here in the upper left, it is a very clear pyramid shape. You've got some fish dying or some organisms dying each year, and you've got a relatively more younger fish than older fish. But if you look at the pyramid down here at the bottom, you see it's very different. You've got this huge number of young fish and then very high mortality. And looking at the relative ratios of these, you can kind of get an idea of what's going to happen, as these huge number of young fish in this bottom one, they're going to dominate for a few years because there's so many of them. The thing about populations is that if they're in a steady state, then the ratio of one age class to the other won't change. And so the pyramids will retain their shape. They'll just get fatter. You can add more organisms. The population can grow, but the ratios between the age classes will stay the same if the population is in steady state. Sometimes in fisheries, though, we don't get nice pyramids. Here is a numbers pyramid for the crappie in Spring Lake, and it looks nothing like a pyramid. First, you'll notice that we have some extremely old fish. 9 years old is very old for a white crappie. And you'll see that we have a huge number of age 8 fish. And you can also see how that year class has dominated the lake for a long time. Because look at the number of age 7 fish. You've got this huge number of age 8 fish and hardly any age 7 fish. That's probably because this cohort that's age 8 was so dominant that the age 7 year class, so the fish that were born the following year, didn't have a chance. And then we didn't even find any age 6 fish. And then we had a few number of age 5 fish. And then you start to see some of the younger fish starting to have larger numbers. And so probably this cohort that is age 3 when we took this sample will also dominate the lake for several years. And I would bet that in the years following, we saw fewer numbers of the cohorts that came after this age 3 cohort. Well, this is a classic white crappie pattern, the boom and bust, where you'll have one age class that just dominates for years, and then the next few year classes don't do very well. So that's the sort of information you can get by looking at age structure. By the way, today's lecture is brought to you by Dickey's Barbecue, I think in St. Louis. Very good place to eat. Okay. Well, let's talk a lot about mortality, because mortality is kind of a big deal in fish management. So we get our mortality estimates by looking at our age data. This is one of the reasons that we take ages off of fish. We've talked about, we looked at age growth. That's a very important use of age data, but also to look at the percent of fish that die each year. And understanding that helps us understand our population. You remember our three important dynamic rate functions that define a population: growth rate, mortality rate, birth rate. And so understanding those helps you understand what's going on. And in fish management, we're always trying to manipulate these rates to achieve our goal. When we talk about fishes, in general, we have two big phases when it comes to mortality: the young of the year phase and the adult phase. The young of the year, the larval fish mortality, is usually very, very high, extremely high, and there's a lot of variation. We just saw that with the white crappie data, that you might have strong year class one year and a weak year class the next year. But in general, the mortality is very high as a larval fish, but then as an adult, it's much more consistent. You tend to get the same percentage of adults that die each year. Consequently, most larval fish have a very low chance of making it through their first winter. Most larval fish are going to die. But if you make it through that first winter, then you've got a much better chance of living longer. And we also separate these two because as fish managers, we tend to focus more on the adult mortality because we have a lot more control over that. And of course, it's probably a little bit easier to measure, and the adult fish are the ones that we're most interested in. So if you looked at a graph representing fish population size versus age, it might look something like this. And you'll note that we've got the fish numbers on the y-axis, age on the x-axis. And you'll see you've got this huge number of age 0 fish, like orders of magnitude higher than the adults. And think about fish are the classic R-selected species where they have lots of young, but they don't often put a whole lot of care into them, kind of that shotgun effect, figuring that you put a lot of young out there and chances are a few of them will survive. And then you've got this huge drop-off, but then a more relative mortality rate in the adult years. In real life, the graph rarely looks this clean. In real life, if we looked at these kind of data, it's going to look more like this, where you've got kind of low values for the young fish, and then kind of a spike, and then you've got that nice steady drop-off. Well, how can we have fewer young fish than old fish? This is not like that crappie graph where you just have a strong year class or a weak year class. You see this almost every time when you're looking at the numbers of fish versus the ages. Well, how is that possible? Well, it has something to do with your gear, not with the actual population. And so those young age classes are not recruiting to the gear. And so if we're doing electrofishing or trap netting, you're not catching larval fish. You're not catching the small fish. And so that's why your graphs look like that. So you don't really have fewer young fish than old fish. You're just not catching the young fish. So when we're doing our mortality estimates, again, we're sort of concentrating on adult mortality. We're only looking at the age classes that recruit to the gear. So when we do mortality, we're going to ignore these young age classes. So our first step is to do this plot and get a feel for when do the fish fully recruit to the gear. And that's going to be sort of where you see this highest number of fish, right? You can see here like the age 2 fish are starting to recruit to the gear, but they're not fully recruiting to the gear, so we don't want to use them because they'll screw up our numbers. So we would just use the age classes that fully recruit to the gear. When we look at the number versus age, you see kind of a nice curve to it. It's not a linear relationship here, it's curvilinear. Well, why is this curved? It's curved. This is a classic pattern that you see in ecology. When you lose a percentage each year, this is a geometric decline or an exponential decay, the actual numbers will give you a curvilinear response. And we see this with lots of phenomena phenomena in biology. You also see this in exponential decay, like radioactive decay. When you lose a percentage each time, you get a curved graph. Whereas if you have an arithmetic decline, where you lose the same number each year, that would give you a straight line. So if we lost, say, 100 fish from the year class every year, so every year 100 fish die, that's an arithmetic decline, and that would be a straight line. But biology doesn't often work like that. We lose a percentage each year. And so we lose, say, 20% each year. That's going to give us a curved line like we see. And that's what we see in real life. So we have this curved line. We need to do some math on it, get some parameters from it. We want to straighten this line. How do we straighten a curved line? Well, we've already done this. You'll recall when we had the weight-length regression, that was a curved relationship. And how did you straighten that so that you could do some easier linear regression on it? You log transformed it. And so if we log transform the number of fish, that's going to straighten out this line, and then it'll be easier to do the math. So that's what we'll do. Now, this time, we're using the natural log, not the base 10 log. Before we did the base 10 log, and that's because the nature of the weight-length relationship was a power relationship, so a base 10 transformation was appropriate. This is a different kind of relationship, and so we're going to use the natural log, and this is, again, the natural log is developed based upon this theory of losing a percentage every year. You'll also note that instead of log transforming both values, we're only going to take the natural log of the number of fish. We're not going to transform age. Okay, so that's how this is a little bit different. But when we do it, we get something that's called a catch curve. And the catch curve gives us a nice straight line. You'll notice on the y-axis, we've got the log of the number of fish versus the age on the x-axis. And now we can just do simple linear regression and fit a straight line to these points. And here we have the equation for the straight line. We have a very high R squared. That's what a catch curve is. And from this catch curve, then we can calculate mortality. Because the negative slope of this curve is what we call total mortality, and we symbolize it with a Z. Excuse me. So again, note that this is going to have the actual slope to this line is negative because you're losing fish every year. So the natural log of the numbers has to go down. The line has to slope downward. And so it's always going to have a negative slope. We want to report mortality as a positive number, so we take the negative of the slope. So we take a negative of a negative number. So when you report mortality, it will be a positive number, but it represents negative slope. Don't get too confused by this. It's straightforward. So this is actually called total instantaneous mortality, and it's represented by Z. And so from that, that tells us the total number of fish that leave the population. So we have to ask ourselves then, how can fish die? Or how can we get mortality? Well, we have two basic ways that fish can die. One is called natural mortality, and that's just what it sounds like. Just fish dying naturally. Old age, or senescence. Fish can starve. They can be preyed upon. They can be eaten, right? Disease can get them. Or they can go over the spillway. That would also be sort of a natural way of leaving the population. All of those are glommed together in what we call natural mortality, which we symbolize by capital letter M. But in fisheries, we're often also concerned with another type of mortality, which is fishing mortality, capital F, right? Because that's another way that fish can be yoinked out of the population. And these numbers are related in that Z equals F plus M. And that's a classic equation that you will see everywhere, and you probably should commit to memory. Now, note that I said that these are instantaneous rates, not actual rates. We'll discuss them in a little bit more detail. To get the actual mortality rates, we need to do a little mathematics, okay? Because we're working sort of with log transform numbers, we sort of need to untransform the numbers, all right? So the first actual rate that we want to look at is called survival. It's capital letter S, and that is the percentage of fish that survive each year. We get this number from this equation. S equals E to the negative Z. So from the total instantaneous mortality, we can estimate the percent of fish that survive each year. Once we have S, then we can get A, which is annual mortality, which would be the opposite of survival, right? That's the percent of fish that die each year. And so if that's the opposite, the complement to it, then those two numbers are related in this manner. A equals 1 minus S. Pretty much straightforward, right? If 70% of the fish survive, then 30% of the fish die each year. Okay, so Z, F, and M are instantaneous rates. That's the mortality at an instant, at a point in time. And these numbers are very important mathematically, but can be difficult to understand intuitively, right? If I said the instantaneous mortality is 1.2 or 0.8, in your brain, you can't really quite get your head around that. Whereas S and A are actual rates. The mortality or of survival not at an instant, but over a long period like a year. And that is much easier for us to wrap our heads around. The analogy here is the difference between your average speed and your speedometer in your car, right? If I drive back down to my parents' house, say it's about 250 miles, if it takes me 5 hours, that's roughly 50 miles per hour, average, right? But think about it, if I'm driving home, there are points in time where I'm sitting at a stop sign and going 0, and there are other points in time where I'm on the interstate and I'm doing 65 or 70, right? What my speedometer gives me is my instantaneous rate, how fast I'm going at that instant. But if I looked over a longer period, then I would get my average rate, which would be different, okay? So if the actual rates are a little bit more intuitive and easier for us to wrap our heads around, why do we even mess with the instantaneous rates? Well, the big reason is that's what we can get from the catch curve, right? The catch curve will give us this instantaneous rate, so that's where we start from, and then we can easily convert that to the actual rates. Another reason we use those is that the population is constantly changing, right? And so calculating a percent mortality can be different if the numbers in the populations are always changing. And so by reducing things to an instantaneous rate, it makes it easier to estimate with precision. And so we need the mortality over a short period of time, like an instant. The instantaneous rates are also useful for modeling, for example. They're additive, so we can add them together like F plus M equals Z. So there are good mathematical reasons for coming up with the instantaneous rates. However, if we want to sort of intuitively understand what's going on in the population, the actual rates are easier to understand. And so we can get those values from the instantaneous rates. So it's easy to calculate them all, and as long as you kind of understand what they each mean, then you can sort of get a grasp on this concept of mortality. Okay. So, how are we going to estimate mortality? Very simple. We go take a sample of fish, we age them, we throw out the age classes that don't fully recruit to the gear, we make that catch curve, which is the log of the number of fish on the y-axis versus age on the x-axis. Fit a line to those data. The negative slope of that line is z, which is total mortality. Then we can plug z into that equation to get s. We plug s into the equation to get a. There we have our estimates of survival and mortality. So for example, that graph I showed you earlier, the slope was negative 0.34, so z is positive 0.34. Plug that into this equation. We just take e raised to the negative z, so now we're going back to the negative, but again, just plug the numbers in, it's fine. E to the negative 0.34 can be done on a calculator. In Excel, the function is called exp. It's just e raised to a number, so now we're untransforming the numbers. E is the opposite of natural log. So when we natural log transformed them, now we're using e to untransform them. And so then that gives us s is 0.71, or 71% of the fish survive each year. Then we plug that into our other equation. If 71% of the fish survive each year, then 29% die each year. And there you go. So if you look at the actual number of fish for the population that recruits to the gear, you can see that each year 29% of that cohort is going to die. Or put another way, for each adult fish in this population, they have roughly just a little over a 1 in 4 chance of dying within the next year. And that's mortality rate and survival rate. Here's another example. Let's say total more instantaneous mortality is 1.54, so it's a lot higher. What are S and A? Well, you plug it in. S is 21%, and annual mortality is 79%. So if total mortality is higher, survivorship goes down. That makes sense, right? If you've got higher mortality, you've got fewer fish surviving. Also note that that's another characteristic of instantaneous rates. They can be greater than 1. It's not really a percentage. But S and A, survival and annual mortality, are actual rates, and those are bounded by 0 and 1. So that's just another characteristic that you need to get comfortable with. Okay, so we have a few assumptions with this sort of analysis. The assumptions are that mortality is constant across all age classes. So once we look at the age classes that recruit to the gear, we're assuming that the mortality is constant from age class to age class. We are assuming that mortality is constant across years, and so that each year mortality does not change. And we're assuming constant recruitment. So each year we are getting new fish recruiting to the youngest age class, and then the mortality is constant. And these are the characteristics you have of a steady state population. Now, the question is how likely is this to happen in a real population? Well, that's the rub. You can sort of assume that mortality across age classes might be the same for the adult fish, but you have to think about what happens when those fish get to a certain size where they start being recruited by the fishermen. And so the mortality might go up, right? Is mortality consistent across years? Well, we know that, especially like in things like rivers and that, or weather patterns change, but mortality can change. Is recruitment constant every year? We already talked about how young of the year mortality is quite variable, and we have strong year classes and young year classes. So those assumptions may or may not be tenable. However, if you take large samples and you make these mortality estimates across several years, then all of that stuff sort of comes out in the wash, and these can be useful techniques. However, there are other techniques and other types of modeling you can do that will take into account this stochasticity or the variability that is inherent in natural populations. So these are what I'm showing you here are the basic population models which we can build off of, but again, used properly, they can be very useful. They're very useful for modeling, and they're also very useful for comparing among different populations. Now let's talk about total mortality in a little more detail. Recall that Z equals F and M. We know how to get Z. We know how to get survival and annual mortality from Z, but what about F and M? How do we get those numbers? How do we break this Z down into its constituent parts? Well, F is fishing mortality, and an easy way to get that is with a creel study, right? So if we're talking to the anglers and seeing how many they keep, if we have some tagged fish and we're looking and they're calling in the tags or whatever, these are all done to estimate fishing mortality, to get a feel for how many fish are being kept by the anglers. So if we do that, then we can calculate big F. Well, then we can just subtract to get M. M is really tough. It's really tough to figure out how fish are dying via natural mortality. So usually we have Z, we get F, we subtract to get M. Also note that we said that natural mortality, a significant or a portion of natural mortality might be spillway loss. And Dr. Heidinger always said that people tend to forget about spillway loss, but it can actually be a significant portion of natural mortality. So that is something that also could perhaps be estimated to help give you an idea of how much of that natural mortality is due to spillway mortality. Now, as far as how do I take that creel data and use that to calculate F, that's for another time. That can be complicated. There are a lot of assumptions involved there, but realize that that's sort of what we do with that creel data, is we use that to estimate big F so that we can subtract and get big M. Now, big F, fishing mortality, is a big deal to us because that's what we're often using to manage the fishery. If we can control big F, if we can influence fishing mortality, then that's how we're trying to influence our population and by influencing overall mortality. So if we reduce F, and so say we put on restrictions or shut down a fishery or whatever, that's going to reduce fishing mortality. We can control that through regulations. Well then, if we're dropping F, then Z should also reduce, should also go down, right? If fishing mortality goes down, then total mortality should go down, and we'll get higher survival. Makes sense, right? But you got to think about a fishing population. What happens if you reduce F? Well, now you've got more fish and more competition, and doesn't basic ecology suggest that more competition means more deaths? So natural mortality will go up. And we call this compensatory mortality. And so by reducing fishing mortality, we might be increasing natural mortality. And so you might not get an actual effect on the size of the population. And in the same way, if you increase F so that the fishing mortality gets higher, so say you liberalize the harvest, people are taking more fish, so now fishing mortality goes higher. Well, you'd think, okay, well, if fishing mortality is higher, then total mortality should go higher. But it might not, because if you take out more fish, then the remaining fish are going to survive better, so natural mortality goes down, right? And that's actually one of the cornerstones of fish management. If we increase F and remove more fish, the remaining ones will actually grow better and survive better, and so the actual population size won't change. And so basically we're removing these fish, but then those fish are being replaced by the ones that remain, and so the population stays at a steady state. And that's kind of one of the goals for fish management, is to hit that sweet spot where we're removing more fish, but the remaining ones are replacing them. And so then we can come back next year and remove those fish, and the remaining ones will replace them. So just by increasing fishing mortality, we don't necessarily increase total mortality. So we can harvest more fish without changing the population size. But can this go on forever? Can you extend that logically to say, well, if I remove more fish, then natural mortality will go down, will compensate. So let's remove even more fish. Let's remove even more fish. Let's remove all the fish. Well, see, that doesn't work, right? At some point, that relationship is going to break down, and the natural mortality will not be able to compensate. At some point, you're going to, if you keep increasing fishing pressure, then natural mortality will not decrease any further. And then you're going to have, if you increase fishing mortality too much, well, then the remaining fish can't replace the ones that are taken out, because you're going to have too few fish, so they're not going to be able to find each other and mate. And you're going to have lots of small fish, and so they're not going to be in that sweet spot of their growth pattern. And consequently, then, your population can decrease. So if you increase fishing pressure too much to where the population starts to shrink, that's called recruitment overfishing. And that can be a big problem. And so that's what we're doing with fish management, is we're trying to manipulate these mortality rates, but we're trying to find that sweet spot. And if fishing mortality gets too high, natural mortality can only drop so far, or can only compensate so much, and then you're still going to have too much mortality, and you're not going to be able to replace those fish that you're taking out. Well, another problem we have in fish management is that there's no incentive for individual fishermen to not increase F past this compensation point. So if you look at it from the point of view of the individual fisherman, increasing F and just increasing it as far as you can go makes perfect sense, right? But in that case, then you increase F past the compensation point to where the natural mortality can't compensate, and you can get recruitment overfishing. This is known as the tragedy of the commons, and this is a common idea that you're going to hear in population ecology and economic ecology and economics. You see the same kind of thing. Let's illustrate it with an example. Classic example. Let's say that I have a pasture, okay? And it's an open pasture, it's owned by the government, for example, or nobody owns it. So I don't own this pasture. This pasture is just there, and there's no fences, there's no regulations, there's nothing. It's just, here's the pasture. All right, well, if there's a farmer living there, the farmer is going to put a cow on this pasture and let the cow graze and let the cow produce milk, and that's how I'm going to get milk, right, from this cow living in this pasture. And so this cow grazes in this big pasture, and it's fine, because grass can compensate, right? As the cow eats some grass, that's mortality from the grass's point of view. But what's grass do? The grass grows back, right? And it's just like taking fish out of a population. The remaining fish grow back and replace them. Okay, so we're fine, right? This cow just kind of grazes around, gets all it wants to eat. The farmer gets milk from the cow. The pasture grass compensates, no problem. Well, if this goes on for a little bit, another farmer is going to notice that. And this other farmer is going to say, that's a good idea. And so he's going to put his cow in the pasture too, right? And so now Farmer A and Farmer B each have a cow in the pasture. Both of these cows are going and they're grazing. And again, not a problem, because it's two cows in this big pasture. The cows eat here, eat the grass down. The cows move over here to eat. This grass compensates. The cows just graze around. The grass compensates. The pasture's fine. Okay, so now we have two farmers each of which has a cow and each of which is getting milk. We're supporting 2 farmers. That's great. Well, what's going to happen? The first farmer is going to say, you know what? I can put another cow on here. You know, he put a cow, the other farmer, you know, he put an extra cow on here, and we're fine. And if I put another cow on there, I can get twice as much milk, right? I can make a lot more money with no extra effort. Adding, you know, the second cow didn't affect the pasture, so let me add a third cow, right? I can get almost twice the milk with no extra cost. It seems logical. Well, what's the second farmer going to do? Same thing. And then a third farmer is going to see this. And so this is going to keep going on. Everybody's going to say, well, why don't I just add another cow? It's no cost to me. I'm going to get more milk. It seems a logical thing to do. But where's this going to end up? Pretty soon, there are going to be too many cows, right? Pretty soon, there's going to be too many cows. The pasture can't compensate, and everyone's cows die. Maybe that's a little dramatic. Maybe the cows don't die, but certainly their milk production goes way down. And consequently, now we have a situation where everybody loses because they've reached that point, past the point of compensation. And that's what the tragedy of the commons is all about. What happened was the profits were accrued by individual farmers, but the costs were borne by the group. All right? So each farmer looks at this pasture and says, I should put as many cows as I want, as I can jam into this pasture, right? Because each cow is just more milk for me. And so each farmer is thinking that. But because they're all thinking that, and because they're all putting cows in this pasture, then they're going to go past the compensation point. The pasture can't compensate, and so then the costs of lower milk production get spread out among the entire group. Or if this is, say, this is, you know, owned by the government, then taxpayers own this land, which is now being destroyed by these cows, and so that cost gets borne by all of us. And so you could, you know, I would argue you could extend this idea to a lot of economic factors. Say pollution, right? Why, say pollution, or let's just say, you know, say there's a factory that produces something like paper. Paper mills are really bad polluters, can be really bad polluters. Okay, well, for the person who owns the mill, who invests money in that mill, it makes perfect sense, right? Everybody needs paper. You know, I can buy the trees, I can buy the machinery, I can pay the people to do this, to make the paper, and I can make a lot of money. It's a huge incentive for me as an individual. And yeah, I'm going to produce a lot of pollution, but that pollution gets released into the atmosphere, right? That pollution gets released into the water. That pollution, which is a cost, is spread among everybody. And if I live next door and I don't care about paper, and I don't own stock in this paper company, I get no benefit, but I have to bear a little bit of that cost because of the pollution. Now in our society, you know, it's not quite that simple, right? Because I'm probably doing something that is giving me a benefit, and then some of my cost is getting spread to the other citizens. But that's sort of the idea behind the tragedy of the commons, is that you've got individuals who are accruing the benefits, but they're not having to pay all the costs associated with those benefits. The costs are spread out among the group. And so this creates a paradox. The short-term decisions by individuals make perfect sense. It makes perfect sense to add more cows to the pasture because I can, there's very little cost to me. All I got to do is buy the cow, and I have the potential to accrue a lot of benefits. But the long-term results are going to be bad for me and for everyone else. And I might even see that, but I don't care. Because if I don't jump in now and at least get some profits now, then somebody else is going to get them. So the short-term decisions are great, but they lead to long-term consequences which eventually are going to come back and bite me. And that's kind of a paradox, and that's kind of one of the results of the tragedy of the commons, and it happens with fisheries, right? So everybody says, jump in. For an individual fisher, it makes tons of sense to grab as many fish as I can. Just fish as hard as I can, because I'm going to go sell these and make money, and if I don't, somebody else will, right? Which makes perfect sense. But if I do that, and everyone else is going to do the same thing, and then all of a sudden we're going to reach past that compensation point, and then nobody's going to have any fish, and we're all going to suffer. That's the tragedy of the commons. And so it tends to lead to overexploitation. And this is one of the main arguments for regulation. So people want to argue that some people would argue that the market will take care of this, that eventually people will understand that their short-term decisions are bad, and so they will figure out ways to limit their taking of the fishes, or limit the taking of the resources, and the individuals in the market will kind of reach a balance where they can make profit but not have these long-term costs or these long-term consequences. It just doesn't work like that. Okay, that's in a lot of markets that can work, in a lot of markets that does not work, and that's why we have government regulations. That's why the citizens come together and say, look, your short-term decisions are affecting all of you and all of us in the negative in the long run. And so we need to have some sort of regulations to limit fishing mortality, to limit entry, so that we can have a sustainable fishery, and so that, yes, your profits or people's profits might be lower in the short term, but they'll be better in the long run because we won't overexploit the resource. And so that's the idea behind the tragedy of the commons. That's the idea behind manipulating fishing mortality. And that's why we spend so much time trying to estimate these mortality rates, and so we can use them to make these decisions. Okay, so that's the big idea behind mortality. A couple of sub-ideas that are kind of neat that we can use here is something called the catch curve residuals. You'll remember the catch curve is when we take and plot the log transformed number of fish versus age. We get a nice straight line. That's how we get our total mortality. But we can get more information from that catch curve. If you recall from your stats, residual is the difference between the data point, and the actual line fit to those data points, right? And the better the line fits the points, the smaller the residuals, so on and so forth. Linear regression is based upon the least square residual lines. So the line that linear regression gives you is the line that minimizes these residuals, but there's still going to be some residuals, right? And those residuals in a fishery, and the residuals from a catch curve, can give you information about year class strength, right? So if you look, say this particular point here, the catch curve regression line represents the expected number of organisms, or the expected log transform number of fish at each age class. It's our best guess at how many organisms should be in that age class, based upon the average, or looking at all the age classes together, right? That's our best guess. However, for this particular point that we're looking at here, you see that it's actually below that. So that year class is actually smaller than what's expected given the overall mortality rate for this population. Well, we can begin to ask ourselves why. How come that year class is not as big as we would expect given the mortality of this population? Well, what we can do is we can extract the residual, and we can extract the residual for each of these points, and then we can try and correlate that with other factors. For example, why might a year class be lower than expected? Perhaps river levels were lower that year, Perhaps rainfall levels were lower that year. Perhaps it was warmer that year. Or anything that could have happened that year that might have affected the year class strength, or when that or might have reflected recruitment or natality the year those fish were born. And if you look at other points in this particular example, you see that here this age 2 year class is right on the line. So that year class has very small residual. The age 3 year class has is lower than what we expected too. Again, here's the catch curve we were looking at earlier, and the points below the regression line represent poor year classes, and above the mean, I say above the mean here, above the regression line mean, good year classes. Okay, and so the farther above or below the mean, the stronger or weaker the year class relative to all other year classes. And that distance above or below the regression line is the residual, and we can mathematically extract that. And so you can look at those residuals and see if they're correlated with something that happened the year that fish was born. So if I took out the residuals and say compared them to river levels, I might find that those year classes that are above the line, that have a positive catch curve residual, the year they were born, the river levels were higher. And those that are below the catch curve regression line, their residuals, which are negative, maybe those correlate well with river levels that were low the year they were born, or something like that. The point is we can take those residuals from the catch curve as an estimate of how strong or weak the year class is, and then we can perhaps correlate that with something that occurred the year that fish was born, or something like that. At any rate, the catch curve residuals is a really neat way to try to understand the difference between year class strengths. Okay, so that was a lot of mortality. That's because mortality is a big deal in fisheries. The last thing we talked about that's important to a population is natality. We're not going to talk about this very much. The births are just not as studied as much as mortality, okay, for a number of reasons. We've already mentioned that reproduction is usually not a problem in most fish populations. You've got plenty of fish, so people aren't as interested in the number of births every year. There's also tons of variability. So from year to year, you've got lots of variability. It's difficult to try to pinpoint that down. If you're going to study natality, you are going to need very different techniques, right? The young fish are not recruiting to your gear that you use for adult fish. So you're going to need to do things like shoreline seining, ichthyoplankton tows, light traps, all those things we do to try to look at smaller fish. And that's how we're going to get at recruitment. Other reasons it's not studied as much, these require significantly more effort, whereas measuring the adult fish often takes perhaps less effort. It's easier to standardize the effort maybe. Also, we're mostly interested in the adult fish. We're looking at fish that people can catch or people that can eat. And the adult mortality rates tend to be more steady. So that's kind of why we tend to focus more on adult fish. But we can't forget about recruitment, and we can't forget about reproduction, and we need different techniques. Understanding this will give you a more full understanding of your fish population. Okay, so that has been a lot about mortality and age structure and things like that. This concludes our discussion about fish populations. A lot of important information here. We're going to have a few homework problems to look at some of these things. So take a look at the homework, take a look at the PowerPoints again. Let me know if you've got any questions. And that's all I've got for today. See you later.